Welcome to this presentation all about butterflies. Through this presentation you should learn some new information about butterflies and how you can help them in your local area. This work has been funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Scottish Natural Heritage as part of the Helping Hands for Butterflies project. Butterfly Conservation is a UK-wide charity and we were founded in 1968, and we have a mission to conserve our butterflies, moths and our environment. We do that by taking practical conservation work to conserve those species. We promote the scientific study of butterflies and moths. We safeguard the most important sites, but also we really want to encourage the public to enjoy butterflies and moths and to really help them in their local areas. So butterflies and moths belong to a group called the Lepidoptera, which just means scaly wings. And if you look at the photograph here, you'll see that all these little scales are packed onto the wings of this butterfly. They're almost like pixels on a screen, and these help to make up the patterns on the butterfly's wings. There's around 180,000 species of butterfly and moth worldwide. And in the UK we have 59 species which are either resident here or regular migrants. Those regular migrants often come from Europe or Africa every year and can breed here. But there's over 2,500 species of moth in the UK, so butterflies are greatly outnumbered by moths in the UK and around the world. So butterflies get most of their food from plants, and whenever they're an adult they spend a lot of their time drinking nectar from flowers. And you can see in the photograph here, this is a butterfly called the large white butterfly. You can see from the front of its head there's a long proboscis, which is like a tongue or a straw, which can suck up nectar from the flowers. This is a source of sugar for them and it gives them energy to fly around. But whenever they're a larvae or a caterpillar, they mostly feed upon leaves or seeds or other parts of plants, and this is when they get the nutrients which will sustain them for the rest of their lives. But further to that, they can actually supplement their minerals with things like human sweat, animal waste or dead animals. But this beautiful butterfly in the photograph here is called the purple emperor. And the purple emperor mostly lives at the tops of willow trees, but people can attract it down from those trees to feed upon horrible food like rancid shrimp paste and other foods which people put out for this butterfly so that they can see it coming down from the tree and they can get some beautiful photographs like this. So butterflies are cold-blooded animals and they can only fly if their body temperature can be raised to over 27 degrees Celsius. And they can heat their bodies in a couple of different ways. First of all, they can bask upon the ground and they'll funnel the heat from the ground towards the centres of their bodies. This can heat the centres of their bodies up, and especially the muscles, which allow them to fly. But then if it goes cold, you'll notice them closing their wings if they can, and they make a little tent over their bodies, and this can slow the cooling down. Before I go on talking about more butterflies, I'll show you some of the brilliant moths that we have. Things like the garden tiger moth, which is a very large moth, which used to be very common in gardens. It's a species which has declined by over 90% in 40 years though, but you can often still see the caterpillars, which are sometimes known as woolly bears. They're hairy brown caterpillars, which sometimes people find upon paths in late summer. Then there's a narrow-bordered bee hawk moth, which is one of my favourite species because it's a moth which looks just like a bumblebee. You can see it's covered in hair with different patterns, just like a bee would look. This might deter predators such as birds from attacking this moth. Then finally we've got the emperor moth. This is a very large species and you can find them on heather moorland because the caterpillars mostly feed upon heather. If you look closely here then you can see that if a predator went to attack this species, it can flash its wings and it looks almost like eyes, and this could deter predators such as birds from attacking this moth too. And then this is a species called the vapour moth, and the female of that species has no wings at all. The male has wings though, and he can fly to the female and they can mate, and then the female will lay dozens of eggs like this. This is a picture of the male and you can see the beautiful caterpillar here. So one of the easiest life cycles of butterflies to remember is the orange tip. This is a typical springtime species now and it's fairly easy to see in much of the UK. So in springtime, around May or June, you'll often see males and females. They'll get together and they'll mate. And then the female will lay her eggs on the tops of certain plants. Mostly this is a plant called cuckoo flower. There's another one also called garlic mustard, and these are the two main caterpillar food plants for this species. The orange tip is distinctive because the female lays most of her eggs at the top of the plant, very close to the flower, because the caterpillars will eat the seed pods as they develop. You can zoom in here and see those orange tip eggs, and you can actually go out to look for these eggs in your own area. This is how the caterpillar looks as it begins to develop. It's very well camouflaged against the seed pod here. And eventually, once the caterpillar has reached a certain size, it makes a chrysalis or a cocoon. It will crawl off somewhere onto a tree or a shrub or a fence post, for example. Anything which is solid, and it can spin this beautiful cocoon, and it will remain there over winter until they emerge the year after. So the orange tip is a normal life cycle, but there are some variations on that. And you've got some species which actually hibernate as adults. Common species such as peacock and small tortoiseshell actually spend the winter as adult butterflies, and oftentimes you'll see them even as early as January or February. If there's a warm day, they will come out. If you do find some like that in your home, you can put them somewhere cool but not freezing and dry and with an exit, so that whenever they wake up in spring, they're able to escape. Those which do survive the winter will emerge early in spring as the temperatures increase, and they will lay their eggs. Those caterpillars will develop all summer and emerge as adults in late summer, and then they will remain as adults through the winter and start the life cycle again. But we also get several migrant species of butterfly, especially the painted lady and red admiral butterflies. The main breeding ground of the painted lady is sub-Saharan Africa, and as the year progresses from around January, February and March, those butterflies in Africa begin to fly north. This is to find more food for the caterpillars, but also to avoid parasitic wasps which can lay their eggs inside the caterpillars and the eggs of these species. So they begin to fly north from sub-Saharan Africa to northern Africa and then into southern Europe and beyond. However, they can survive the winter in the UK. But it's been estimated that the painted lady does a 9,000-mile round trip from tropical Africa to even the Arctic Circle and back again every single year. But they do this over 6 generations, so no one butterfly does the entire journey. You'll have adults which can feed, then fly on, then they'll lay their eggs. Those old adults will die, but their offspring will continue the journey. And in 2009, it was estimated that 11 million came into the UK and 26 million left. One of the fascinating things about butterflies is that they can have extremely close relationships with some ants. This is a species called the large blue butterfly, which is mostly found in chalk grasslands in southern England. And this species of butterfly actually requires ants in order for it to complete its life cycle. So the large blue will lay its eggs upon wild thyme or marjoram. And you can see the white egg at the top of the plant here. And in the lower photo, if you look towards the center, you'll see a caterpillar as it develops. It's a kind of a pink color. At a certain stage then, the caterpillars drop to the ground and they'll begin to trick yellow meadow ants into bringing them into their nests. And they do this in a few different ways. First of all, they secrete a sugary substance from a thing called the honey gland, and the ants are attracted to this sweet sugary substance. But they also begin to produce pheromones and mimic the noises made by queen ant grubs. So they actually smell like an ant, and then the ants find it and bring it back inside their nest, thinking that it's one of their own. Then within the nest, they can beg for food. They do this by chirping. They can actually rub certain parts of their bodies together to make a squeaking noise, which promotes the ants to feed them more food. But then they also begin to eat the ant grubs as well within the nest. So they're actually feeding upon the ants within the nest. All being well, the butterfly will remain in the ant nest through the winter and emerge the following year as a beautiful large blue butterfly. However, the large blue became extinct in the UK in 1979, and this was for various reasons, including over-collecting by butterfly enthusiasts and habitat loss. But the yellow meadow ant that this butterfly needs also requires very short vegetation on south-facing sunny hillsides. And one of the things that happened was that a disease called myxomatosis was introduced. This disease wiped out almost all of the rabbits in the UK, so on certain sites the vegetation grew long, the ants died off, and then the butterflies died off too. However, it's not all bad news, and the butterfly was reintroduced from Sweden in 1984 and is now doing quite well in some of these locations. So, 4 species of butterfly and over 60 species of moth have become extinct in the UK during the last century. One of our most recent reports on this was the State of UK Butterflies 2015 report, and it found that 3/4 of our UK species had declined in their range or their abundance over the past 40 years. But it's not all been bad news. Some species are expanding, such as the orange tip. This could be because climate change might be helping this species to spread. Some of the main reasons why butterflies are declining include agricultural intensification, and this has mostly happened following the Second World War, and much of our countryside is just not suitable for butterflies and moths or bees or other wildlife anymore. But also, how we manage woodlands has changed as well, and in many woodlands they've become very dark places because there's been a lack of coppicing, and certain butterflies need the warm spaces created by rides and glades in woodlands, and those just don't exist anymore in many places. Other types of habitat loss have included 98% of our flower-rich meadows, 40% of broadleaf woodlands, 80% of chalk grasslands, and we've lost 200,000 miles of hedgerow, which was such an important habitat for many insects. We're also doing research on climate change and pesticides to see what effects those are having too. So we can help butterflies and moths in various different ways, and Butterfly Conservation has 35 reserves covering almost 2,000 acres. 3 of these reserves are in Scotland. We also do work in the wider landscape too, and we work with farmers and councils and other landowners to really, even though we can't directly manage those lands, we can work with other people to encourage them to manage their land for butterflies and moths. One of the reserves which you might like to visit is Wester Moss near Stirling. This is a lowland raised bog habitat, and this is a type of habitat which has declined by 90% in area in Scotland, and is home to the large heath butterfly, which is one of our priority species. The large heath lays its eggs upon hare's tail cotton grass, and the caterpillars feed upon it. But hare's tail cotton grass requires wet conditions, and unfortunately many of our bogs have been drained for agriculture or for peat extraction. And so we have a team of volunteers called the Bog Squad, and they go in to erect these dams and to remove invasive plants. Through the Helping Hands for Butterflies project, I also run volunteer work parties where we go into habitats for butterflies and create better conditions for those butterflies to thrive. Through the Helping Hands for Butterflies project, I've also been working with volunteers to create urban meadows and parks across central Scotland in places like Glasgow, Edinburgh, Hamilton, Blantyre and Kirkintilloch. And this requires volunteers at every stage. Volunteers who can help with sowing wildflower seeds or planting plug plants. And this is an example of one of the meadows we've created already. This is a Springburn Park in Glasgow. We need more volunteers to help with this, so if you'd like to help, just get in touch. When we consider why we should conserve butterflies and moths, for me one of the most important things is just their intrinsic value. They're beautiful animals, and it's really important that we help them to thrive. But they've also got a tremendous educational value, and we can talk to school children, for example, or for other members of the community, and really help them to connect with nature through the world of butterflies and moths. But they're also extremely important for ecosystems, especially food webs for other animals. And for example, to raise one nest of blue tits, it can take over 40,000 food items. And these need to be live food, so this can be the grubs of butterflies and moths and other insects, which can help sustain birds in the garden. And it's just really good for our mental and physical health too. To get outside on a sunny day and look for butterflies is a good thing for our health. They're also good pollinators of some wildflowers, and for example, some orchids can only be pollinated by certain species of moth or butterfly. And if we didn't have those insects, then we could easily lose those orchids too. Gardening is one of my passions, and it's important to remember that gardens cover more than 1 million hectares of land in the UK. So this could be land which is much better for wildlife and therefore helps these species to recover. Butterflies they need nectar, they need food plants for the larvae or caterpillars, but they also need places to bask and to hibernate and to remain through the winter. Unfortunately, many of the plants which you can get in garden centres are what I call plastic plants. These are things like petunia, polyanthus, pelargonium, begonia, and busy lizzie. And unfortunately, many of these plants have been bred and selected to look really good with very showy blooms, but they have no pollen or nectar which is accessible for insects. So really in the garden centre, these are the plants which I avoid, and almost everything else that you can get is suitable for insects though. Here's some of my top tips for gardening for butterflies, especially early in spring and early summer too. Lady smock, or also known as cuckoo flower, is one of the caterpillar plants for orange tips, and it's a really good one to grow in a wet area for the garden. But you can also grow aubrietia, which is another caterpillar plant for some species of white butterfly. You can also grow bugle or muscari. Willows are very important, as well as early flowering heathers. These are two of the most important sources of pollen and nectar early on in the year. So they'll be helping the butterflies through the nectar, but they'll also be helping queen bumblebees which have just emerged from hibernation too. But also native wildflowers are important as well. Things like forget-me-nots and native primroses are good in gardens. Then later in the year you've got things like sedums, which are very drought tolerant plants, so you can put them in planters, and they're very attractive to butterflies and bees. Also things like Verbena bonariensis and buddleia. But if you do have a buddleia in the garden, remember that you have to cut back the dead flower heads every year, otherwise the buddleia can become invasive in other places. Herbs are important too, and things like lavender, thyme, oregano, and allium, which also can be known as chives, are very good for insects in the garden too. Keeping on with the theme, we've got echinacea and thistles. Scabious and cardoon are two plants as well, which are very useful because they've got these very large heads packed full of tiny flowers, so the insects can rest upon them, but also get a meal as well. Then finally, very late in the summer, plants like Michaelmas daisy will give butterflies a meal before they go into hibernation, and therefore it will help them to stock up on energy and help them to survive the winter. But it's also really important that we have caterpillar plants as well if we want to increase their populations. Nettles and thistles are caterpillar plants for several of the common species of butterfly, like peacock, small tortoiseshell, and commas. Not everybody wants to grow those in their garden, and I always recommend that if you've got a patch of nettles in the garden, especially in a sunny place, just leave those nettles. Don't try to get rid of them, don't cut them down, just leave them for the butterflies. Many of the white butterflies also feed upon plants within the Brassica family, so this includes cabbages and nasturtiums. And what I do is I actually just grow extra cabbages every year, so I've got some which I keep for myself, but others I just put into the flower border, and the butterflies are welcome to eat those. Nasturtiums are a very easy one to grow from seed, and those are useful for the small white and large white butterfly caterpillars. Holly and ivy are really important for various species, but especially for the holly blue butterfly. Now this isn't very common in Scotland yet, but it's very widespread throughout the rest of the UK. The holly blue will lay its eggs upon holly or ivy flowers. But holly and ivy themselves also have flowers too, which are attractive to insects generally. So they're both good plants to have in the garden. Birdsfoot trefoil is a wildflower which is really useful for the common blue butterfly, but several day-flying moths will also use it for their caterpillars too. If you want more information, just go to butterfly-conservation.org/gardening. One of my top tips is to try to really just grow wild with things. If you've got a lawn, let it grow for a year and see what wildflowers come up. If you don't get many wildflowers, you can add things like birdsfoot trefoil, sorrel, scabious, and various types of grasses, which can help butterflies and moths. It's so much more interesting to have an area like this instead of just a boring lawn. We're also recommending that people go peat free as well. Now the photograph here shows Western moss in Stirling, which is a lowland raised bog, but we've lost many of our lowland raised bogs because of horticultural use of peat. So these bogs are actually destroyed for peat, which goes into compost. Now when they're intact, they're homes to beautiful wildlife, things like the green hair-streaked butterfly or damselflies or rare plants which can only live in these habitats. But when they're dug up for peat extraction, this is what happens. So the habitat is completely destroyed and cannot be usefully restored. In the UK, every year, gardeners use 3 billion litres of peat in compost. So this is resulting in the destruction of precious habitats for wildlife, but also this is putting more carbon back into the atmosphere because bogs store more carbon than the world's forests combined. So by digging up these bogs and releasing this carbon, we're making climate change worse. There really is no excuse to use peat and compost anymore. These bogs can also prevent flooding because they absorb an enormous amount of water. So basically, things that you can do when you're out in the garden centre is check the bag when you buy, or simply make your own compost. But you can also buy new peat-free compost, and you should ask for that in the garden centres. So if you want to help butterflies then, you can get involved in our various volunteering programs. You can get involved in recording butterflies, and there's a simple app called I Record Butterflies, and you can use that to send in sightings of butterflies that you see in your garden or anywhere you are. You can garden for butterflies and help them locally. Or if you're a farmer or a land manager and you have a larger amount of land, you can speak to us about how to improve your sites for butterflies. Finally, you can support us through membership, and we rely on membership subscriptions to keep us going. And you can do this from as little as £36 per year, and this is equivalent to about a cup of coffee per month. And these subscriptions really help us to keep going and doing more work. So if you join in, you actually get a membership pack with things like a gardening booklet, ID charts, membership of your local branch, and invitations to events. And in Scotland, one of our biggest events is the Scottish Recorders Gathering. We have 2 of these events every year, and over 150 people come together to talk about recording butterflies and moths, and they're great days out. You'll also get our butterfly newsletter 3 times per year, which keeps you up to date with all of our work. So thank you for listening, and I hope you've learned something new. You can visit our website to find out more about butterflies and moths and how you can support our work.